Frank has been in the game for over 7 years, but he has only been considered a good brawler for in and around 1 year since his long time ago rework. So why was that rework so fundamentally necessary, and what did Frank pass to even reach that point? Hope you enjoyed today's video, and let's start off with Frank's release, because there is a lot of differences between the Frank of 7 years ago and the Frank of nowadays. So, Frank was released in the 21st of May 2018, and by far the easiest thing to notice it was the lack of HP, because back then, translated to nowadays HP, he would have the equivalent of 11,200. That's all his HP. Nowadays he has 13,400 HP, so huge difference in the HP. Then his damage was actually higher on the basic attack. His basic attack used to deal 2,400 damage, while nowadays it only deals 2,320. But his super back then also only dealt 2,400 damage, while nowadays it deals 2,480. Not that big of a difference, yet still important to mention. Now, a big difference it is his basic attack range. His basic attack range nowadays it's 6 tiles, but back when he was released it was only 5 tiles. It's hard to have a real idea of how small the range really was, but you should never underestimate any sort of range change, especially if it's just more than 2/3 of a tile. Lastly, we still have the range of the super, which back then was 6.67 tiles and nowadays it is 7 whole tiles. His first star power was also a lot different, but I'll talk about that in a second, and he didn't have gadgets or hypercharges, and he did not have the passive of attacking faster with less HP. So yes, that means that he would always attack with this insanely long cooldown. So there was a lot of differences, but was Frank actually good on his release? Well, not really. The lack of range and HP and not that big of a deal damage just simply wasn't good. Frank wasn't usable literally anywhere. There wasn't really much you could do because you would have to stay so close to the enemies that they would just immediately counter you, so there wasn't much place for Frank outside of Foot Brawl. So because of that, in the 19th of June 2018, Frank would receive his first buff, and a really decent one, may I add. His HP would be increased from the nowadays 11,200 to 11,600. On top of that, his basic attack range would be increased from only 5 tiles to 5.67 tiles. Now, even though those are two very relevant and very decent buffs, Frank was still a relatively not that special brawler. He wasn't awful now, at least he was usable in Gen Grab and a very good brawler in Foot Brawl, but outside of that, nothing really that spectacular. On top of that, after those buffs, the hype for Frank kinda died a little bit, so again, in the 31st of August 2018, he would receive another buff, where his basic attack range would be increased again from 5.67 tiles to 6.33 tiles, which is actually more than what he has nowadays. On top of that, his super range would also be increased from 6.67 tiles to 7.33 tiles, so even further range, and this unironically broke Frank. This was one of the only times where Frank was actually considered a broken brawler. He was so strong that he could actually be usable in Bounty. That's how we know how strong Frank really is. When a brawler like him can be used in long range maps, you know he's busted. And the reason was very simple, he just had too much range. It was quite hard to dodge any of his attacks, and especially his super. His super was just really hard to dodge, and if again he connected the super on you, you could forget it. You would most certainly not live. It was really strong. So, because of how insanely broken he was, only 1 month later, in the 27th of September 2018, his damage, his range would be reduced to a middle turn. His range would be reduced from 6.33 tiles to 6 tiles, and his super range would be reduced from 7.33 tiles to 7 tiles. And ever since, Supercell never touched Frank's range ever again. Unfortunately, this middle reversion of Frank's previous buff made him not as great again. He was good in football, decent in gem grab, but that was really about it. Other than that, you just simply didn't saw much Frank, but because he was viable in those two game modes, there was no real need to buff him. Although, in the 29th of January, his first star power received a very generous rework. Remember that I said that his star power worked very different from the star power that we have nowadays? Yeah, now I'm gonna explain what was the big difference. Back then, whenever Frank killed the enemy, instead of just instantly gaining that bonus damage, there was actually a huge difference. He would instead, the defeated enemy, would drop something like their soul, and you could collect the soul to gain the damage buff. So it was very weird, but that was how it used to work. On top of that, the buff was different. Instead of being 25% bonus damage for 12 seconds, back then it was a 40% bonus damage for 10 seconds. And it wasn't really that strong because you had to go and collect those souls. And in the 29th of January, that was when they changed it to how it works nowadays. You kill the enemy and you instantly get the buff. Now, it didn't really help that much. The bonus damage was fine, but if you were in a tricky situation and you killed the enemy, the bonus damage would take a while to get effect because of the permanent unload speed, so there wasn't really that much of a change with the star power rework. It helped in the long term, but for now it wouldn't really do that much. Then, in the 27th of February 2019, a new game mode was introduced to the game, which was Siege. If you don't know what Siege is, it was an old game mode that after a while got removed, but essentially, you would collect some bolts around the middle of the map, and then with those bolts, after a couple seconds or even a little bit more of a minute, you would spawn a ginormous robot, and with that robot, you would develop a push towards the enemy base, which was a Ike turret, which it's essentially a weaker version of the heist safe of nowadays, except it shooted projectiles that dealt a very reasonable amount of damage. And with this being said, Frank had one very strong advantage, which was his super. His super would stun the Ike turret for a whole 2 seconds, and that allowed your team to just do an insane push because the enemy team main source of defense wasn't there. It got stunned, and it was impossible to mess up the stun because guess what? The Ike turret does not move. So Frank was really strong. And because of that, Supercell decided that it was a way too strong and unfair advantage. So, in the 15th of April 2019, his super would now only slightly stun the Ike turret. I don't know exactly by how much, but I will assume it was probably half the duration, something like that. And that made Frank essentially useless on the game mode. He wasn't the fastest because in that game mode what really matters is either being really fast to get the bolts or apply decent pressure / control. And Frank had neither one of those. He had something that was far much stronger and Supercell just took it away from him. And it seems like they probably regretted that choice because only 1 month later, in the 21st of May 2019, his stun duration was brought back to normal. I don't know why they decided to do it, but I guess that they didn't want Frank to have this weirdly unfair advantage. But they regretted doing it because that essentially killed Frank on that game mode, so I guess that it didn't matter having Frank being really strong on one particular game mode, which I agree personally. Then, in 11th of June 2019, Frank would receive another buff to his star power. And at this time, Frank would just receive a meaningless buff after meaningless buff after meaningless buff. Truth being said, Frank was essentially on life support. Supercell would just give him the most random buffs if Frank was starting to really fall into the F tier or to the D tier, at the beginning at least. So, the buff that he would receive would be to his first star power. The bonus damage would be increased from 40% to 50%, and the duration would be increased from 10 seconds to 12 seconds. Considering how Frank worked back then, this change made sense. It was hard to get value out of this star power back in the days because of the unload speed, so having more damage and having a longer duration to take value off, it made sense. Although in the end of the day, it really didn't change much on Frank. So, on the 17th of July 2019, his Sponge Star Power was introduced. And because of how stats worked back in the days, his second Star Power actually gave him more than 10% of his HP. So actually, his second Star Power was stronger than the second Star Power we have nowadays. Regardless, that Star Power didn't really change much. So, in the 29th of August 2019, his Sponge Star Power bonus HP would be increased from plus 1000 to plus 1100, and as you can expect, that didn't change anything. So again, in the 7th of November 2019, his actual HP would be drastically increased from 11,600 to 12,200, an 800 HP buff. I think that this was one of the largest HP buffs I have ever seen. So that actually made Frank somewhat viable, because it was just so much more HP that it took a while for people to really realize how they had to deal with Frank now. Because pure HP can serve as pressure, so for a little while this helped Frank. But inevitably, he was starting to fall off again, and Supercell would repeat history really. They increased his HP again in the 19th of February 2020 from 12,200 to 12,800. So he was kinda back. He was reasonable again because, again, more HP, more pressure, and it was hard to kill Frank. Frank was a very beefy boy, may I say. So it was hard to kill him, and that helped Frank a little bit for a while. And what would also help Frank for a while would be the introduction of gadgets. When his gadget was introduced, it was actually very similar to how it works nowadays, but it was slightly stronger. It lasted for 2 seconds instead of 1.5 seconds. No big deal, especially because just 1 week later, on the 26th of March 2020, his gadget would have its duration reduced from 2 seconds to 1.5 seconds. I don't really know why, because I don't think it was really that toxic, but apparently it just made Frank a little bit too cheesy with the super, so I understand why in the end they had to do this. And the gadget really helped a lot because your super was essentially unstoppable. And that was really good because sometimes you just couldn't use your super if the enemy had even just one counter, so this was a good thing for Frank. And for a while he was usable on Foot Sprawl, on Gem Grab, and he was still a really great pick on Siege because of that massive stun. But unfortunately, this wouldn't last very long because as time has passed, Frank would just get worse and worse. It took a while this time, but he inevitably reached the D tier. So, in the 15th of December 2020, his HP would receive the strongest and most massive buff ever. His HP would be increased from 12,800 to 14,000. More HP than what he has nowadays, yes. But surprisingly, this time the HP buff didn't really help that much actually, which was weird because until now, every single HP buff helped Frank for a while. But this one was different. The situation was different as well. And the problem was simple. We were reaching a point where it didn't matter really how much HP Frank had, because at that point he was just feeding enemy super. And if you're giving Shelly a super just because you have more HP, you might as well be dead so that you won't screw up your team as much. And that was the problem. Frank just gave too much super to the enemy team as well, and that wasn't helpful. Because another thing that I still had mentioned is that there was no tank trait back then, so if you were receiving damage as Frank, you were only giving your enemy super. There was no tank trait, so you would not receive any super back, which was a massive disadvantage. So the HP buff, it just really didn't do much, but at least it showed what was the problem with Frank in the end of the day, which was somewhat nice. Then, in the 26th of February 2021, his second gadget was introduced into the game, which was a horrible gadget. You might ask why, and that's simple. Back then, the gadget didn't have any bonus damage, so pulling enemies towards you was just essentially saying bye-bye to your own existence. It didn't make sense. Frank wanted the exact opposite of the enemy standing close to him. Like, why would I want to pull a Shelly towards me? That's just stupid. So, obviously, the second gadget was just the most ridiculous thing ever. And because of that, in the 7th of April 2021, Supercell would give another buff to Frank, and this time it wouldn't be a HP buff. How crazy is that? His damage, both on the basic attack and the super, would be increased from 2400 to 2480. So now Frank dealt a tiny bit of more damage. Didn't really change much, but hey, a buff is a buff, and at least he could deal a little bit better with higher HP units, especially if he had the first Star Power active, so at least that was something. And another something that Frank would receive would be the tank trait, which wouldn't actually change too much for a while. The tank trait, it essentially only really helped El Primo and Bull because they could be played very aggressively, but because Frank had so many unload cooldowns, the tank trait, at least for a while, wouldn't really do much, so kind of a bummer actually. And just one day later, in the 17th of June, the tank trait would receive a 33% nerf, which was an indirect nerf to Frank, that it was necessary to make El Primo and Bull balanced. So, 4 months later, they tried a little bit of a different approach, where they would instead buff both of Frank's gadgets. His first gadget would now also give Frank invulnerability to El Primo's first gadget. Very specific, I know, but El Primo was a natural counter to El Primo, and the fact that El Primo's gadget was one of the only things that could still interrupt a Frank super was for sure an annoying detail, and it would no longer be like that. But most importantly, his second gadget would now deal double the damage with your next attack. And that's actually really strong. Double damage, it's a really nice trade-off. And for a little while, Frank was a little decent. He wasn't useless, and he had his niche scenarios, and if you connected the second gadget, you would deal a whopping 4,400 damage. And in some scenarios, that could be enough to one-shot certain brawlers. So surely Frank would be better. No. The issue was still there. Unload cooldowns. At this time, it was just clear that those cooldowns were really messing up with Frank. Frank couldn't approach the enemies because of them. The super took too long to unload and could be interrupted. The second gadget, it was very hard, or actually very easy to mess up because of the unload times, and having that much HP in some scenarios could actually even go as far as being a disadvantage. The pure pressure was just no longer enough for Frank, really. Believe it or not, Frank would be 2 whole years with 0 changes, and this one change actually was just a new regulation throughout all of the characters, which was star powers now scaling. So his second star power would now give to Frank 1400 bonus maximum HP when he was maxed out, which obviously changed nothing. Frank stayed in the F tier for 2 whole years. And this is what he got, which was pretty weird, but at this point people were just expecting a rework to Frank. It was said I think in one of Brawl Stars' own podcasts that they eventually would want to rework Frank, so people waited and waited and waited. for 8 months until eventually, in the 25th of June 2024, he received one single buff, which was Frank's main attack unload speed now becomes faster based on how much HP he lost. Which was weird to understand, but when you saw it in Brawl Talk, you understood very well what that meant.
Oh my god, wait, that's too much,
As that by itself wasn't great enough already, Frank also received a hypercharge in the same update, and may I add, a very strong hypercharge. Truly a really solid hypercharge, really good. And with that one single buff, and this is the part where I'll put my personal opinion, I don't understand why they didn't just straight up call it a buff, because there was no real compensation nerf, so very confused on why they called it a rework and not just a straight up buff. Maybe rework sounded more dramatic, because it is. So, in the 1st of July 2024, Frank received one emergency nerf, which was a very simple detail. His maximum unload speed buff, based on how much HP he lost, would be reduced from a 70% unload speed reduction to a 60% unload speed reduction. So normal Frank wouldn't really feel that much of a difference, but if you had like 2000 HP, 4000 HP left, you would for sure tell a bit of a difference. Obviously, this wasn't enough because you cannot just put an overstated brawler suddenly have a unique, really strong rework and a crazy new ability. You just cannot do that. So, in the 28th of August 2024, he will receive a very severe nerf. His HP would be reduced by 10%, going from 14,000 HP to 13,400. His second star power, because it's 10% of your HP, would be reduced from plus 1,400 bonus HP to plus 1,340 maximum HP. And finally, his second gadget bonus damage would be reduced from plus 100% to plus 50%. This was quite insane. The second gadget just became so powerful because if the Frank was at very little HP, like 3000 HP, and if he pulled the second gadget, you would suddenly receive 4400 damage. And guess what? That wasn't very fun. So this nerf was really necessary, otherwise that gadget would become just so toxic. Even with these changes, Frank was still probably one of the strongest brawlers in the game. The only thing that didn't really make Frank S tier was just because there was actually good counters at the time. Thank God. We had Gale, Clancy, Surge, Chester. We had a lot of good picks actually. So that was the only reason why Frank wasn't just the best brawler in the game. There was counterplay, because other brawlers were just really strong. But eventually, when those brawlers would also receive some nerfs, Frank would be on the nerf list as well. So on the 14th of November 2024, he would receive a very simple nerf to his basic attack damage, going from 2480 to 2320. On top of that, these had some tiny nerfs to his hypercharge rate, but they didn't really change too much because he had the tank trait, so that like 3% nerf to the charge rate didn't really affect much because that would just be compensated by the tank trait itself, which would be a really big issue. Getting the hypercharge because of your tank trait just felt genuinely unfair. But the reality is, whenever Frank got that hypercharge, there was essentially nothing you could do. Even baseline Frank was just still so strong. Therefore, in December 10th, 2024, he'd receive another nerf, this time to his first star power. The bonus damage would be reduced from plus 50% to plus 25%. He actually still dealt so much damage with that star power, like each attack would deal 3000 and a couple damage. He could two-shot just so many brawlers if he had that star power activated. And again, if Frank was at little HP, getting one kill and getting a 50% damage buff, he would just shred anything that would dare to come close to him, which was very strong and quite unfair. So, after all of these nerfs, Frank was kind of a balanced brawler. More to the stronger side, but overall not that problematic. But there was still one big issue with Frank, which was drafts. Confused? Allow me to explain. Essentially, the big issue here was that if you picked Frank as a last pick against certain matchups, the enemy simply couldn't do anything. Literally. Certain brawlers just simply cannot pass through a 13,000 HP brick that has a 2-second long-range stun and that can shred enemies once he gets at low HP and with a 360 hypercharge. There are just certain matchups that are literally impossible for certain brawlers to win. And this is kind of a thing that Frank has. He's not the only brawler that can do this, but he's for sure one of the most severe cases, especially if you combine any sort of healer. So Frank, even though in ladder he's not that strong, in high levels of play, he can actually be very strong, especially in the right circumstances. Because on those moments, Frank can literally be a free win. I cannot tell you how many times I just played with one of my friends, Frank Berry, and we just simply won. The enemy couldn't do anything. Which, even though it's very fun, I'm sure it is very unfair to the enemy team. Although this is just something that Supercell cannot fix because this is something about the competitive side of Brawl Stars. Because Frank itself is still strong, yet almost fair. There was just one missing piece to the puzzle that was still left to nerf, and that was Frank's hypercharge. The one thing that truly made Frank very hard to deal with was the hypercharge, and again, how easily you could get it from the tank trades. Like seriously, you could get, if you got lucky, 5 hypercharges throughout the game, and those hypercharges were really game changing, so a nerf to the hypercharge just felt very necessary, and Supercell opted for a classic charge rate nerf, going from 40% to 30%. So instead of needing 2.5 supers, you would now need a whole 3.3 supers, which you can tell the difference so easily. Now you most of the times only get 2 or if you're lucky 3 hypercharges, which is still quite a lot, more than most brawlers can do, but it's a very strong amount. And there you have it, the history of Frank, and it's just crazy how much one single technical buff can really change. Essentially, Supercell, what they did was just fix an issue that Frank had for many years, which was the unload was just unbearable. With Brawl Stars getting faster and quicker gameplay, Frank just needed to adapt somehow, and that was just the perfect buff. Obviously, he was overstated from the beginning, so they had to nerf so many things, but I will generally say I feel like Frank is overall a very balanced brawler. He can be very strong against certain brawlers, but very weak against others, so he is kinda matchup dependent, which is totally fine, and I'm glad that we have certain brawlers that work like that. They make ranked a little bit more strategic on the choices, which I kinda like. So, with all of this being said, hope you enjoyed today's video. If you like, do not forget to subscribe, join our Discord server, link in the description, and I'll see you all on the next video.